On a dark, secluded dead-end road on Whidbey Island, Washington, a car sat parked in a driveway. The door was open. Inside was a man named Russell Douglas, 32 years old, a bullet lodged in his skull. One shot placed precisely between his eyes. Whoever pulled that trigger knew exactly what they were doing and left before anyone passing by would have reason to slow down. The road was quiet enough that the body remained undiscovered long enough for the night to settle fully around it. It was December 26, 2003, and the person who chose that spot knew the island well. Russell Douglas was the estranged husband of Brena Douglas, a woman who owned a hair salon and was drowning in debt. The marriage had been deteriorating for some time. There had been affairs, at least according to Brena. There had been emotional tension, arguments, and a separation that hadn't fully resolved itself. Over the holidays, Russell had been staying at the family home with Brena and their 2 children, trying to hold something together that was already coming apart. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. A man making an effort to reconcile. A man trying to do the right thing for his kids. A man who ended up on a dark road with a gun pointed at his face. The people closest to Russell couldn't name a single enemy. Nobody could produce a reason why someone would want him gone. He wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He hadn't made powerful enemies. He was, by every account, a man who inspired nothing but fondness in the people who knew him, which made the question of who wanted him dead so much harder to answer. Brena was the first person to sit under that question. When she was told that her husband had been murdered, something was off about her response. There were no questions, no immediate flood of grief or panic or the desperate need to understand what had happened. She stood in her doorway, arms crossed, and asked if she could help. That's not the reaction most people have when they're told someone they once loved, someone who is the father of their children, has just been shot dead. Most people crumble. Most people want answers immediately. Brena didn't ask a single question, and the money was there too. Life insurance policies totaling somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. Enough to erase Brena's debt entirely and leave room to breathe. Motive and opportunity, and a reaction that didn't sit right. Investigators circled her for months. But they couldn't place her at the scene. They couldn't find the gun. They couldn't build a case that would hold. Brena remained exactly where she was, out of reach. Then came the phone records. A Las Vegas number had called Russell Douglas several times in the days before his death, including on December 23rd. The number belonged to a woman named Peggy Sue Thomas. At first, that name didn't carry much weight. Peggy explained that she had been back on Whidbey Island for the holidays and had been calling Russell to arrange delivering a Christmas gift on behalf of her friend, Brena. She was open when asked about it, cooperative. Nothing about her gave investigators pause. She answered every question and nothing she said raised a red flag. The conversation ended and Peggy Sue Thomas went back to her life in Las Vegas. Peggy's life, by that point, was the kind of story that didn't follow a straight line. She had grown up on Whidbey Island, served in the Navy as an aircraft mechanic during Operation Desert Storm, married and divorced 3 times, and raised 2 daughters she described as her proudest accomplishment. In the late 1990s, she had physically transformed herself through dedicated exercise and caught the attention organizers. She entered the Mrs. Washington International pageant and won. The sash, the crown, the photographs, all of it found a place of honor in her home. But Peggy never quite fit the image the title suggested. She was more comfortable in jeans and boots than anything the pageant world had in mind for her. By 2003, she was driving limousines for high rollers in Las Vegas, earning tips that sometimes reached into the thousands for a single night. It was, by her own description, one of the best jobs she ever had. What Peggy Sue Thomas was, underneath the titles and the glamour and the easy confidence, was a woman who had been deeply in love with the wrong man. Jim Huden had been part of Peggy's life since childhood. She had carried a crush on him from back when they were young on Whidbey Island, long before either of their lives took the shapes they eventually did. They lost touch, as people do, and each built a separate existence. Jim became a software developer. He sold a program to Microsoft and made a significant amount of money. He settled in Punta Gorda, Florida, with his wife, Jean. and channeled his remaining energy into playing bass guitar in a band called Buck Naked and the Exhibitionist. By most measures, Jim was living a comfortable life, but something shifted in him after he attended a funeral on Whidbey Island in June of 2002. At that funeral, Jim and Peggy reconnected. They had both lost someone they loved, and in that shared grief, something reignited between them. Things moved fast. Feelings that had existed in the background for years suddenly pushed forward into the open. Jim was still married to Jean. Peggy knew that, at least eventually. But the connection was strong enough that both of them made choices they couldn't easily walk back from. Jim began making regular trips to Las Vegas. He told Jean he was looking for gigs for the band. In reality, he was building a second life with Peggy. Jean noticed the change in her husband around the time of that funeral. He became withdrawn, darker, increasingly reliant on alcohol and drugs. The man she had known seemed to recede. She watched it happen and couldn't stop it. By April 2003, Peggy had discovered that Jim had been lying to both of them simultaneously. She flew to Florida and knocked on Jean's front door. The two women, the wife and the girlfriend, stood face to face and confronted the man they both loved. Jim said he loved two women and couldn't choose. Jean told him to decide. He said he chose Jean. Peggy left furious, but they couldn't stay apart. Within months, they were back to meeting in Las Vegas, and Jim was back to lying to his wife about where he was going. In December 2003, Jim told Jean he was spending the holidays with family on Whidbey Island. He went to Peggy instead. On the morning of December 26th, while Peggy and Jim were together at a house on the island, Jim said he wanted to go out for cigarettes. He left sometime between 10 and 11 in the morning. When he came back, Peggy saw nothing unusual. No blood, no agitation, no sign that anything had happened. Just Jim, exactly the way he always looked. That same morning, Russell Douglas was shot once in the head on a dark dead-end road nearby. The investigation went 7 months without breaking open, and then a phone rang. The caller told investigators about a band called Buck Naked and the Exhibitionist and pointed them toward the bass player. His name was Bill Hill, and he lived in Punta Gorda, Florida. Bill Hill had been carrying a secret for 6 months, waiting to figure out what to do with it. He had been on a late-night drive to a gig with Jim Huden about a month after Russell Douglas was murdered when Jim said he needed to tell him something. Bill didn't know what to expect. What Jim said was this. He had been looking for someone who fit the description of an abuser, someone he could punish as a way of avenging abuse he claimed to have suffered at the hands of his stepfather as a child. He believed he had found that person in Russell Douglas, and he said plainly that he had shot him in the head. Bill Hill sat with that confession for 6 months before he made the call. That kind of weight is worth thinking about. Knowing something that enormous, carrying it through ordinary days, sleeping on it, measuring it against your loyalty to someone you considered a friend. 6 months is a long time to hold something like that alone. The information Bill provided cracked the case wide open. He named Jim as the shooter Ted us. He named Peggy Sue Thomas as an accomplice. And he named Brena Douglas, the victim's wife, as someone with knowledge of the plan. Whether Brena played an active role or simply knew what was coming was a distinction that would matter enormously later on. The theory that took shape was specific. Peggy had lured Russell to that secluded road under the pretense of delivering a Christmas gift for Brena. Jim had waited there with a gun. The arrangement, according to what Jim allegedly told Bill, included a financial incentive. Jim was to receive $50,000 for pulling the trigger. Peggy was supposed to receive a portion of the insurance payout. Brena stood to collect the full amount and clear her debts. Peggy denied every element of that theory. She maintained that she had no idea what Jim was planning, that she had never encouraged him to harm anyone, that she had no knowledge of any arrangement involving money, and that she was as shocked as anyone when she eventually learned what had happened. And here's where the story becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, because on one side you have a confession from Jim Huden to his bandmate, a confession that named Peggy as part of the plan. On the other side, you have Peggy's consistent insistence that she was kept in the dark, that Jim acted on his own obsessions and his own damage, and that she was being blamed for the actions of a man she trusted. Both of those things cannot be entirely true, but neither one is easy to dismiss. In August 2004, investigators traveled to Punta Gorda to confront Jim directly. He denied pulling the trigger. He acknowledged being a difficult person, someone capable of poor choices, but not a killer. The interview ended without a confession, and without hard evidence, both Jim and Peggy walked away. The case sat unresolved. Jim was now aware that he had been identified, that his name was in the open, and that time was running out. When Hurricane Charlie made landfall on the west coast of Florida in August 2004, Jim Huden used the chaos to disappear. He crossed into Mexico on September 10, 2004. He settled in Veracruz, a city built around music and sea air and enough anonymity that a man with a new name could build a quiet life. He called himself Jim Martin. He played blues guitar on stages in the city, charmed the people around him, and gave nothing away about where he had come from. The people who knew him in Veracruz described a gentle, emotionally perceptive man. Someone who listened. Someone who made you feel seen. There was, they said, never any sign of violence in him. That description exists in direct contradiction to a bullet fired between a man's eyes. And yet both things were apparently true of the same person. Jean Huden helped him get there. She knew where he was for years, visited him in Mexico, and lied to investigators when they asked. She did it because she loved him, even after everything, even after he had told her the truth about what he had done and who else he claimed was involved. She held that information and protected him for years until her own life fell apart completely. Back in Las Vegas, Peggy Sue Thomas continued driving limos. In 2007, she met a man named Mark Allen, a multi-millionaire oil and horse racing magnate whose thoroughbred won the 2009 Kentucky Derby. They married. The relationship lasted 7 months before Mark separated from Peggy and from $700,000 and a houseboat, which she received in the settlement. Peggy noted that the prenuptial agreement had entitled her to significantly more than that amount, which was her way of saying the gold digger characterization missed the point. But the people who knew her during that time had their own read on what the marriage had been about. It was during this period that Vicky Boyer, a woman who had been Peggy's close friend for years and had always believed in her innocence, had a night in a bar that changed everything she thought she knew. Peggy, drinking, made a comment about taking care of a problem for a friend. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said something about a gun and added that at least this time she would know to throw it in the water. Vicky went home shaking. The remark undid years of trust in a single moment. Peggy has denied that conversation ever happened. And so the question remains, sitting in the same place it has always sat. What did Peggy Sue Thomas actually know, and when did she know it? She insists on her innocence. The people around her at different points came to believe something different. The confession Jim made to Bill Hill named her. Jean Huden, who had every reason to lie and who changed her story multiple times, eventually claimed that Peggy herself had told her she was involved. Jean's credibility was a problem that the prosecution never fully solved. Her account shifted in significant ways between 2004 and 2011, when she finally cooperated with investigators after facing serious criminal charges of her own. The most critical change was this. In 2004, Jean had said Jim never told her that Peggy knew. 7 years later, she said she remembered it differently. The defense noted that kind of shift with obvious relish. A story that doesn't change for 7 years, and then suddenly changes exactly when the person telling it needs something from the legal system is worth examining very carefully. Jim Huden was arrested in Veracruz in 2011, nearly 8 years after Russell Douglas was murdered and returned to Whidbey Island to stand trial. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. Jim Huden was sentenced to 80 years in prison. 1 month after Jim's arrest, investigators came for Peggy. She was formally charged with the murder of Russell Douglas in the summer of 2011. She faced trial in a small community where the story had been told and retold for years, where opinions had already formed. Where the phrase beauty queen murder suspect had followed her name through headlines long enough to become inseparable from it. Just before the trial was set to begin, the prosecution offered Peggy a plea deal. 4 years in prison on a reduced charge of rendering criminal assistance. Peggy accepted. That decision provoked the kind of question that has no comfortable answer. An innocent person accepting prison time is not impossible. It happens. Small communities, complicated histories, unreliable witnesses, and the weight of years of suspicion can make the calculation look different than it does from the outside. Peggy said she was smart enough to recognize that a fair trial in that environment was not guaranteed. That taking 4 years was a better outcome than risking everything before a jury that had already made up its mind. The other reading of that decision is simpler and more obvious. And it is the reading the people who lost Russell Douglas have carried with them ever since. Brena Douglas was never charged. There was no evidence that money changed hands between her and Jim Huden or Peggy Sue Thomas. She remained, in the minds of those who had built this case from the beginning, a suspect in everything but name. She ignored requests to speak publicly about the case. When she was finally approached and asked directly whether she had any involvement in the murder of her husband, she called it harassment and walked away. Russell Douglas had been trying to do right by his family when he died. He was staying with his wife and children over Christmas, trying to hold the pieces of something together. He drove to a dark road expecting to receive a gift. He received something else entirely, one shot. One moment that ended everything he had been and everything he might have become. Jim Huden spent years playing blues guitar under the stars of Veracruz while that family lived with that absence. Peggy Sue Thomas drove high rollers through Las Vegas and married into a fortune while that family lived with that absence. And Brena Douglas continued her life in the same community where the question of what she knew, and when she knew it, never fully went away. The people who loved Russell Douglas waited 8 years for an arrest, and then watched as the trial of the man who pulled the trigger produced a conviction, while the full picture of what was planned and by whom remained fractured, unresolved, and permanently open to argument. There was a verdict. There was not closure. Those are two different things, and the gap between them is where this story continues to live. What makes this case stay with you long after the facts are laid out is not the violence itself, as terrible as that is. It's the ordinary machinery of the relationships, the money, the affairs, the loyalty misplaced in a man who was leading multiple lives simultaneously. A woman who fell in love and either participated in a murder or was used as a tool in one, and spent the rest of her days unable to fully prove which version was true. A man who could charm everyone around him in any room he entered, who spoke about his childhood wounds as justification for the worst thing a person can do to another person. And somewhere in that web, a man named Russell Douglas, who wasn't any of those things, who didn't build a complicated life or carry dangerous secrets, who just wanted to spend Christmas with his kids.